Ned Stark stood in the great September of Baelor beneath the scorching King's Landing sun, feeling the stone beneath his knees. His wrists were bound, and a hush had fallen upon the throng of spectators who came to see how the Lannisters would handle the traitor who had, in their eyes, conspired against the crown. Yet, despite his predicament, Ned held his head high, steel-gray eyes scanning the crowd. He noticed the fear and uncertainty in his daughter Sansa's face, the anger and defiance in Arya's before she was whisked away, and the simmering glee in Joffrey's expression. Cersei, her lips pressed together in what might have been satisfaction or disapproval, stood just behind the boy king. When King Joffrey Baratheon, resplendent in a gilded tunic, announced the sentence, silence turned to a shocked ripple. Instead of calling for Ned Stark's head, Joffrey declared that Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, was to be stripped of all titles and sent to join the Night's Watch in permanent exile. The Watchers gasped. Some might have called it a mercy. Others thought it cunning cruelty. For Ned Stark, in that agonizing moment, the only relief he felt was that his daughters would not have to watch the gleaming sword of Island Pain separate his head from his shoulders. Under heavy guard, he was dragged to a black-sailed ship at the Blackwater Bay that would carry him to Eastwatch by the sea. It was not the path he had expected, but he could not help but feel a sliver of gratitude. His life was spared, and perhaps the old gods had given him a chance to right the wrongs and find a path to protect his family. The city's stench of rot and filth faded behind him, replaced by the salt-laden wind that tugged at his hair and cloak. Iron chains stayed locked around his wrists, but by the time he set foot on the deck, he was too tired to protest. Sometime during the journey, the Lannister men removed his chains. They had no fear that he would jump into the watery depths and swim home to the north, for these were no ordinary waters. The captain, hired by the crown but having no love for the Lannisters, observed Lord Stark with sympathy. On more than one occasion, the man offered him sips of warmed wine, which Ned politely refused until he realized it might soothe his pounding headache. Each night, Ned would find himself leaning against the rails, gazing up at the sky. The sea was wide and rough, but the glimmering stars above reminded him of winter nights in the courtyard at Winterfell. He clung to those memories. In them lay his sense of duty. He arrived at Eastwatch by the sea to a reception of black-clad men. Stewards, builders, and rangers of the Night's Watch assembled under the watchful gaze of the commander at Eastwatch. Edging down the plank from the ship, Ned felt the biting chill in the air. In the distance, the vastness of the wall loomed high, a corridor of ice that seemed to rise like an insurmountable barrier between the realms of men and whatever lay beyond. The duty that this brotherhood upheld was no small thing. He had not intended to ever don the black, but he knew, deep in his bones, that it was an honorable calling. The men parted quietly as he passed, a murmur of recognition running among them. They bowed their heads with varying degrees of respect. Eddard Stark, traitor or not, was still the man who had once been Warden of the North. Without ceremony, Ned found himself escorted to the commander's solar. There stood a short, barrel-chested man with a plain face, apparently the officer in charge of Eastwatch. The man welcomed him with a curt nod. There was a tension in the air, for even though Ned had been condemned to the Watch, many in Black harbored respect for the erstwhile Lord of Winterfell. Few saw him as a traitor. Most believed him an honorable man, caught in the vile politics of King's Landing. But whatever their personal feelings, they bowed to their new brother. Ned felt the unfamiliar weight of the black cloak across his shoulders. The vow he recited still thundered in his mind. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. But these words brought him little comfort. He had never chosen this. A part of him found it painfully ironic. He had once beheaded a deserter of the Night's Watch in Winterfell's courtyard, explaining to his son Bran that the one who passes the sentence must swing the sword. And now, here he stood, forcibly sworn to a duty he had never pledged willingly. Still, if the realm required him, he would do what he could to keep it safe. For a time, that was enough. He began his duties in earnest, keeping a modest bunk among the Black brothers, rising before dawn to stand his watch along the top of the palisade at Eastwatch. The wind whipped at him like a living, howling creature, and he often felt the cold in his very bones. News from south of the Neck reached them rarely, but when it came, it was always a swirl of half-truths and rumors. Men arriving to join the watch whispered that the realm was ablaze with conflict. Robb Stark, Ned's own son, had called the Northern Banners. War had begun in earnest. Tywin Lannister's hosts had clashed with the Tullys. Renly Baratheon had crowned himself king in Highgarden's fields. And, in the gloom of Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon was said to be gathering an army of his own. Every piece of news ached in Ned's heart. He thought of Catelyn and his children. He yearned to rush to their side. Yet he had made that vow, with the old gods as witnesses, to wear the black. Guilt gnawed at him, though he tried to silence it with the knowledge that he was powerless to help. And still, the realm's troubles continued to weigh upon him. Then, one bleak evening, a heavily cloaked messenger arrived by boat. The guards at the gate gave him entry, and the man insisted he bore a message for the man once known as Lord Eddard Stark. The fact that this traveler had come specifically seeking Ned was unusual enough to rouse caution among the Black brothers. But they permitted him a short, discreet meeting. In a small, torchlit chamber, Ned met the stranger, who revealed beneath his hood a face deeply lined by worry and cold. He handed Ned a sealed parchment, the wax bearing a stag's head sigil. The contents, once Ned read them by the wavering light of a single candle, shattered whatever quiet acceptance he had cultivated at Eastwatch. The letter was signed in a sharp, terse script. Stannis Baratheon, Lord of Dragonstone, King of the Undulls and the First Men by right of blood. In succinct lines, Stannis explained his claim, that Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella were the product of incest, not true Baratheons. That the Iron Throne belonged to Stannis himself as Robert's true heir. He declared that he had knowledge of Ned's innocence and that Ned Stark, as the rightful Warden of the North, was needed to save the realm from the false kings. The letter ended with a single line that burned into Ned's mind. Your country bleeds. Will you stand idle on the wall? Or will you bring the North to the true king? Ned sank onto a small stool and felt the weight of destiny come crashing down upon him. He could not deny that Joffrey's claim was false. He had risked his life in King's Landing precisely to expose that lie. For that, he had nearly lost his head. Now, he was trapped in black, and only a vow separated him from the family he was sworn by birth to protect. The letter's words had a certain ring of truth to them, at least insofar as Stannis's rightful claim was concerned. Ned had always believed that the line of succession should pass to the elder brother if Robert had left no trueborn offspring. He had no love for Stannis's rigid personality, but the man was correct in this. The realm was in chaos because of Lannister deceit. Weeks passed, and he carried the letter in the inner pocket of his cloak. He read and reread it many times, always telling himself that he was oath-bound to remain at the Wall, to renounce lands and titles, to never again play a part in the realm's wars. And each time, the letter called to him like a whisper of memory, speaking of duty to his family, duty to the North, duty to the truth. Meanwhile, ravens arrived with news of Robb's victories in the field. He had captured Jaime Lannister, rumor said, and was declared king in the North by his men. Another rumor spoke of Catelyn forging alliances, traveling to treat with Renly, or seeking an audience with the Lord of Riverrun, her father. The realm was truly aflame with kings. Ned's every thought was torn between the binding words of the Watch and the love he bore his children. Amid these swirling doubts, an incident shook Eastwatch. Rangers returning from a voyage beyond the Wall reported signs that the Whites were stirring, that the ancient legends of the others might not be mere fables. The commander feared an attack, or at least some dark movement in the far north. Tensions rose. Whispers circulated of unknown shadows in the forest. Ned might have believed his best course was to remain, to secure the defense of the realm from these potential terrors. Yet every time a new letter or rumor arrived, it pulled him south in spirit. Every night, the same question haunted him. Was he truly doing his best to protect the realm by standing guard here? Or did his family and King Stannis, for Ned now recognized him as the rightful heir, need him more? Gradually, a plan formed in Ned's mind. Though the vow to the Watch was sacred, He recognized that it had been forced on him by a false king. Did that make the vow any less binding? The old Ned Stark would have said no. A vow was a vow, but the new Ned Stark, broken in King's Landing, humiliated, seeing how the realm had suffered, found himself questioning that absolute notion. If Stannis, the rightful heir, needed him to set the realm to rights, was it not his duty to answer that call? If his own son Robb had taken up arms, was it not Ned's place to guide him? A father who let his son march alone was no father at all. Once the thought began, it snowballed with unstoppable force. Ned knew enough about the Watch to orchestrate a covert escape. It was said that desertion from the Night's Watch was punishable by death, but he also knew that the men here were not eager to see him as a common deserter. They respected him. Many had served in Winterfell's ranks or had known men who did, but that did not guarantee their cooperation. He confided in a select few, men who had once been Northerners themselves, men who carried in their hearts a loyalty to House Stark. Most were sworn to the Watch with their own vows, but they listened to him with quiet respect as he spoke of the realm's crisis. He was careful, for fear of being labeled a traitor anew, or worse, of leaving behind resentment that might cause strife among the Black Brothers. But these men understood something else. If the rightful king was to ascend the throne, and if the entire continent was threatened by war or by the dark creatures beyond the wall, perhaps the oath to serve the realm in black was not so different from the oath that would bring justice to the Seven Kingdoms. Late one night, under cover of a moonless sky, Ned Stark disappeared from Eastwatch by the sea. He left a short message for the commander, apologizing for breaking his vow, acknowledging that he would be forever labeled a deserter, but proclaiming he could not stand idle while his family and the true king faced the storm of war. "The realm must be saved from the Lannisters," he wrote, "and the others beyond the wall both. I go to unite the North." Then he slid onto a small boat with 2 loyal companions, men who found reason enough in their hearts to believe that Ned's cause outweighed the vow of neutrality. They rowed across the black waters until the lights of Eastwatch were naught but specks in the distance. They traveled by sea first, hugging the ragged coastline, hoping to avoid detection by any patrolling Lannister ships. Cold waves licked at the boat's sides, and storms nearly capsized them more than once. Still, Ned pressed on, leading them with a quiet determination that reminded his companions of the Wolf of Winterfell. When at last they could slip ashore near the Bay of Seals, Ned found himself standing on the stony beach of his homeland again. It was a battered, lonely stretch of coast, far from any major port. The pine trees rose at the edges of the shore, and the wind carried the scents of the north. Damp earth, salt, and a faint trace of pine sap. Despite the desperation of his journey, Ned felt his spirits lift at the taste of northern air on his tongue. From there, they traveled by foot and horseback through hidden trails, skirting the watchful eyes of any who might betray them to the Lannisters or Seven Hells, report them to the Night's Watch. They were a small band, traveling lightly, and they utilized Ned's knowledge of lesser-used roads to remain inconspicuous. A cloak dyed dull gray replaced his black. He carried no banner, yet in his heart, Ned Stark was rallying the North. They marched for days, resting in abandoned huts or hidden glens. Occasionally, they encountered local villagers, most of whom gaped at Ned in disbelief, for they had been told the Lord of Winterfell was as good as dead or locked away in the black forever. Word spread in hushed whispers. Ned Stark had returned, not as a ghost, but in flesh, and he bore dire tidings. As these rumors trickled through the countryside, men began to approach them. Some were old hunters who had served House Stark in their youth. Others were hedge knights who revered the Stark name and remembered the just rule of Eddard Stark. They brought meager supplies, offered their swords, or provided knowledge of safe houses. Ned, though wary, accepted their help. His immediate goal was to rally enough loyalists to ensure his message reached the major houses of the North. The Umbers, the Karstarks, the Mormonts, the Boltons, though the last gave Ned pause, for the Bolton words and reputation were cause for worry. Ultimately, he had to let them know he was alive and prepared to stand with Stannis Baratheon for the good of the realm. Soon, his small fellowship grew. A retinue of perhaps 30 men accompanied him, each dedicated to the idea that the false king on the Iron Throne must be dethroned, that King Stannis was the rightful heir, and that Eddard Stark had a duty to help. One evening, they camped in a pine grove lit by a brilliant moon. A pair of ravens soared overhead, and Ned felt an uneasy thrill in his heart. He knew that if the Night's Watch discovered his flight, they might brand him a deserter. He knew that if he were captured by the Lannisters, they would likely execute him. And yet, none of this touched the core of his resolve. The old gods were with him in that quiet glade. He could feel them in the towering pines, in the hush of the wind, in the silent stars overhead. He prayed to them for guidance, for a sign, and in the rustling leaves he seemed to hear them. Go south, Ned Stark, and bring the north with you. Traveling steadily, they drew closer to Winterfell. The holdfast that had once been Ned's seat seemed both near and impossibly far, layered with memories. He'd learned from stray travelers that his son, Robb Stark, was away in the Riverlands, waging war against the Lannisters. Winterfell itself was in the care of Maester Luwin and the small household guard that remained. Bran and Rickon were said to be within its walls. Hearing that reminded Ned of the ache in his chest. He had not even had time to warn them of his approach, nor to prepare them for what was coming. But he would not place them in harm's way. Indeed, he had half a mind to keep moving, to avoid Winterfell altogether, so that if the place were attacked for harboring a traitor, they could truthfully claim ignorance of him. In the end, love for his home overcame caution. Under the cover of night, Ned and his companions approached the walls of Winterfell by crossing the old causeway that spanned a slow-moving stream. The guards on duty, glimpsing the shapes in the dark, shouted a challenge. One of Ned's loyalists, an old man-at-arms who had once served in Winterfell's garrison, called out, "We bring Ned Stark, rightful lord of Winterfell, father to King Robb." The guards hesitated only a heartbeat, then rushed to open the gate. Torches flared. Men stumbled forward in shock, and a hush rippled through the courtyard. It was as though the very stones recognized Ned's presence. Maester Luwin, summoned from his chambers, came running. His maester's chain clattering around his neck, candlelight illuminating his worried face. In an instant, his wide eyes found Ned's. For a moment, both men simply stared, neither believing the scene truly before them. Then the maester rushed forward, clasping Ned's hand, tears brimming in his eyes. Wordlessly, Ned drew the older man into an embrace, as though to anchor himself to reality. He was home, at least for a night. A quick flurry of footsteps brought his youngest son, Rickon, into the courtyard, guided by two members of the household staff. The child gaped at his father, then barreled into him, sobbing that he thought his father was gone forever. Ned held Rickon tight and felt tears burn his own eyes. He had missed so much, had lost so much time. If only he could remain here, guiding his sons, protecting them as was his duty. But the letter from Stannis was pressed close to his heart, and the knowledge of the realm's strife weighed heavily on him. When at last he released Rickon, he asked after Bran. The boy was asleep, Luwin explained, still crippled from his fall, but better, day by day, in spirit if not in body. Ned breathed thanks to the old gods. Perhaps, come morning, he would see Bran. That very night, Ned gathered the few advisors who remained in Winterfell, Maester Luwin, Ser Roderick Castle, and several of the more senior household staff. By the flickering flames of the hearth, he explained what had transpired. His condemnation in King's Landing, his forced vow, his receipt of Stannis' letter, and, ultimately, his desertion from the Watch. Shock, anger, and concern mingled on their faces. Ser Roderick, that steady rock of a man, did not question Ned's choices. "My lord," he said, voice low but resolute, "we have long known the boy on the throne is not Baratheon. If Stannis calls for your support, he must have good reason. Robb has declared for the north. But might we not unite with Stannis to ensure the Lannisters are undone?" Maester Luwin frowned, weaving his fingers together. "Lord Stark, I understand the burden you bear, but deserting the Watch, it is not only a breach of vow, it places the entire North in jeopardy if the Watch cannot rely on Northern aid. The realm may judge you for it." Ned lowered his gaze. "I understand, Maester. but I cannot stand idle while my family fights and the realm crumbles under a false king. The old gods witness that I did not choose this lightly." He paused, then told them of what the rangers had reported. The whites, the danger stirring beyond the wall. "I do not mean to abandon the watch. If I can help Stannis secure the throne, he might provide the resources necessary to face what is coming in the north. We need a united realm if we're to survive." Ser Roderick's eyes hardened with understanding. "Then let us raise the banners, my lord. It may be that the best path to ensuring Winterfell's safety is to align with Stannis Baratheon. If Robb sees sense in it, we might form a common front."